Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive, this time on A/B testing for product professionals. We're going to be looking at some detailed lesson plans from a course that was designed for product professionals specifically. I was struck by how A/B testing just goes way beyond just websites. We're talking about marketing strategies, product launches, even things like retail checkout designs. Seeing if a new design in a retail store can boost sales. It's really cool.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's all about using data to make better decisions, which is so important in the world of product development, especially in the world we live in today where things are so fast-paced. You're constantly trying to figure out what works best for your users, what's resonating.
Exactly. So let's say you're working on a music streaming app, and you want to see if a new recommendation algorithm is going to lead to more user engagement. How do you actually do that?
Well, that's where A/B testing comes into play. What you would do is you divide your users into two groups. One group would experience the new algorithm, and the other group would stick with the old one.
Okay, so we've got our two groups.
Right. And the key here is to make sure that those two groups are very similar in terms of their demographics, their listening habits, and anything else that might be relevant to the test. The goal here is to isolate the impact of the new algorithm. We want to make sure that any differences we see in engagement are actually due to the algorithm and not some other factor.
So if one group is a bunch of heavy metal fans and the other is all, classical music listeners, that's going to kind of throw things off, right?
Exactly. You want to create a level playing field, so to speak, so that you can make a valid comparison. Like, for example, let's say you're testing out a new feature that allows users to create collaborative playlists. Well, you'd want to make sure that both groups have a similar mix of users who, are already engaging in some kind of social sharing within the app.
Okay, so that makes sense. You've got to have those groups set up the right way. So what's next?
Okay, so now we need to talk about how long to run the test for. You don't want to run it for too short of a time period, because you might not gather enough data to draw a meaningful conclusion. But you also don't want to run it for too long, because other factors might come into play that might muddy the waters.
Yeah, what if you were testing a new feature right before a huge music festival? I imagine that could impact, user behavior and make it hard to really tell if the new feature is working or not.
Right. So figuring out the right amount of time to run the test is really important. It's a balancing act for sure. You want to have enough data to be statistically confident in your results, but you also have to account for those potential external factors.
This reminds me of something else that the lesson plan really hammered on. Choosing the right metrics to track during the test. It's not just about overall page views or clicks or something like that, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's about choosing metrics that are specific to what you're trying to achieve with the test. So for a music app, we might want to look at things like how much time are users spending listening to music? Are they creating more playlists? Are they sharing more songs with their friends? Those are the kinds of things that will tell you if that new recommendation algorithm or that collaborative playlist feature is actually hitting the mark.
Okay, so it's about choosing the right metrics for the job. So now let's get into how we actually assign users to these groups. The lesson plan talks about something called randomized design tests, which sounds pretty straightforward to me.
It is. The idea is that you want to randomly assign each user to either the treatment group, which is the group that experiences the change, or the control group, which is the group that stays with the existing experience.
Okay, so literally just flipping a coin.
Yeah, each user has an equal chance of being in either group.
Okay, that makes sense. So that helps ensure we're not, accidentally introducing any bias into the experiment.
Exactly. We want to minimize the influence of any lurking variables that could throw off our results, and randomization is our best defense against that.
Now, I'm guessing the number of users in each group matters too. I remember seeing something in the lesson plan about sample size.
Yeah, you're right. Sample size is a really important thing to think about. If your sample size is too small, you might not be able to detect any statistically significant differences between the two groups. It's like trying to hear a whisper in a crowded room. You might miss some important nuances. But then on the other hand, if your sample size is too big, then you're just wasting resources.
So how do you find that sweet spot?
Well, there are some statistical tools and formulas that can help you figure out the right sample size based on how much statistical power you want to have. And there are even some online tools like GPower, which can do the calculations for you. But ultimately, for product professionals, it often comes down to a judgment call. Based on the size of your user base and the specific tests that you're conducting.
Right. If you've got a brand new feature that only a small group of users even have access to, you've got to kind of be more strategic about that sample size.
Absolutely. You're always working within the constraints of your user base and your product development timeline. And, sometimes you just can't fully randomize. Like maybe you're testing a feature that depends on someone's location or what kind of device they're using. In those cases, complete randomization just might not be feasible.
So that's where those matched pair design tests come in, right? The lesson plan talked about using those in situations where you can't randomly assign users to groups.
Exactly. So, for example, let's say you're testing a new feature that's only available on mobile devices. Well, you can't randomly assign all of your users to the treatment group because some of them might not even have the app on their phone.
Okay, so how do you account for that?
Well, what you would do is you would create matched pairs of users based on similar characteristics. In this case, whether or not they use the app on their mobile device. So you might find a user who uses the app on their phone and pair them with another user who has similar demographics and usage patterns, but doesn't use the app on their phone.
So it's like you're trying to find twins in your data to make a more controlled comparison.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it. And this helps to reduce variability in your results and make them more reliable. And it's especially useful when you're dealing with what we call heterogeneous units, which are units that are more complex and have lots of different characteristics.
Now, I'm thinking back to that retail example we were talking about before, the one about testing a new loyalty program in different stores. So if you can't randomly assign customers to different stores, you could match stores together based on things like location or size or even average sales volume.
Right. You'd want to match stores that are as similar to each other as possible so that you can minimize the influence of any other factors that might be skewing your results.
So it's all about finding those comparable units to make a fair comparison. And then once you have your matched pairs set up, you can implement the change, whether it's a new feature, a loyalty program, a different checkout design, in one unit of each pair and keep the other one as the control.
Exactly. And then you carefully measure your key metrics to see if that change is actually making a difference.
So it's kind of like setting up a series of mini experiments, but with that extra layer of control. That helps you isolate the impact of the specific change that you're testing.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. It's all about being very methodical and strategic and data-driven in how you approach it.
I like it.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about setting up these tests and designing them, but let's say you're actually in the middle of running a test for that new collaborative playlist feature. You're monitoring the data, you're watching those engagement numbers. How do you know when you've seen enough? When do you call it a day and actually start digging into the results?
That's a really good question. It's definitely not a set it and forget it type of thing. You do need to kind of keep an eye on how things are going, but you also don't want to overanalyze things.
Yeah, I can see myself obsessively checking the numbers every hour.
Yeah, it's tempting. But you actually bring up a good point because if you keep checking the data too often, you might jump to conclusions too early. Or even worse, you might actually introduce some bias without realizing it. It's kind of like checking a cake in the oven. If you keep opening the door and poking at it, you might end up pulling it out before it's actually done.
Right, let the data bake.
Exactly.
So what are some signs that it might be time to actually start looking at the results?
Well, the first thing is that you need to have enough data to be statistically significant. That means you need a big enough sample size and you need to have run the test for long enough so that you can be pretty confident that the differences you're seeing between those two groups aren't just due to random checks.
So it's not just about seeing a difference in those engagement metrics.
Right.
It's about making sure that the difference is actually meaningful.
Exactly. And even if something is statistically significant, it might not actually be practically significant. You might see a small increase in something like playlist creation that is statistically significant. But if it's such a tiny increase that it's not really going to have a big impact on your overall business goals,
right,
is it really worth the effort of implementing that new feature?
Right. You've got to look at the big picture.
Yeah.
So statistical significance doesn't always equal practical significance.
Exactly.
You brought up a good point earlier about external factors.
Yeah.
So what if something unexpected happens during your test?
Well, that's definitely something you need to keep in mind. If something big happens in the world or even just something specific to your industry, it could throw off your results and make it really hard to figure out what's actually causing those changes.
So going back to that music festival example.
Yeah.
If a huge music festival happens right in the middle of your test, who knows what that's going to do to the data?
Exactly. You might see a huge spike in engagement, but it might have nothing to do with the new feature that you're testing.
So it sounds like you've got to be super vigilant and adaptable when you're running these A/B tests.
For sure. You need to be paying attention to what's happening both inside and outside of your product.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the things that can go right, but I'm also curious about some of the common pitfalls. what are some of the ways that these tests can go wrong?
Oh, yeah. There are definitely some traps that people can fall into. One of the biggest ones is ending the test too early. People get impatient and they don't give it enough time to run its course.
They pull that cake out of the oven too soon.
Exactly.
And it's all gooey in the middle.
Yeah, so patience is really key when you're doing A/B testing. Another common mistake is trying to test too many things at once. People get excited and they want to throw everything but the kitchen sink into the test. But that just makes it harder to figure out what's actually having an impact.
So pick one thing to focus on.
Yeah, one change, one hypothesis, keep it simple.
Okay, one change, one hypothesis.
Yep.
I like it. The lesson plan also mentions something called selection bias, which sounds a little intimidating.
Yeah, selection bias is something you definitely want to avoid. Basically, it happens when you don't randomize your user groups properly. So for example, let's say you accidentally assign all of your power users to the treatment group, the ones who are using your app for hours every single day. Well, they're probably going to love any new feature you throw at them. But that doesn't mean that the average user is going to feel the same way.
Right. Just because the power users love it doesn't mean it's a good idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Selection bias can really skew your results and make you think that a feature is a hit when it's actually not.
So randomization is key.
Absolutely. It helps to level the playing field.
So are there any other sneaky things that we should watch out for?
Well, there are also what we call lurking variables. These are hidden factors that can influence your results without you even realizing it.
Those sound tricky. How do you even know what to look for?
Yeah, that's the tough part. It really requires you to think critically and to understand your users and your product really well. So for instance, let's say you're testing a new onboarding flow in your music app, and you see this huge increase in user engagement. But what you didn't realize is that a really popular music documentary just came out on Netflix, and everyone's suddenly obsessed with music again.
So it's not actually your onboarding flow that's working its magic. It's just this random external factor.
Exactly. Lurking variables can be really sneaky. You have to be like a data detective, always questioning your assumptions and trying to come up with alternative explanations for the patterns you're seeing in the data.
So A/B testing is not just about crunching numbers. It's about being curious and skeptical and always learning.
I think that's a great way to put it. The best A/B testers are the ones who embrace that kind of mindset.
So we've talked a lot about the nuts and bolts of A/B testing, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of the bigger picture implications of all this.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that A/B testing really represents a shift towards a more data-driven approach to product development. We're moving away from making decisions based on gut feelings or intuition. Instead, we're relying on evidence and data to guide our choices.
Like we're moving from a world of art to a world of science.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly experimenting and seeing what actually works.
Exactly. And that has huge implications for how we actually design and build and launch products these days. It allows us to really be in tune with what users actually need. We can learn from our mistakes and hopefully create products that people really love.
It's not just about like changing a button color or tweaking a headline. It's about like a whole different way of thinking about product development.
It's about building a culture of experimentation where every decision is backed up by data. And this is happening everywhere, not just in tech. We're talking retail, healthcare, all sorts of industries.
It's pretty amazing to think about how this one simple technique can have such a big impact. But I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today. The mechanics of A/B testing, how important metrics and randomization are all the things that can go wrong.
Yeah, we've really gone deep.
And how this data-driven approach can really change the game.
I hope it's been helpful for everyone listening.
I know, I've learned a lot. And the cool thing is that this isn't just about websites. We've seen how A/B testing can be used for all sorts of things. Marketing campaigns, new product launches, even like figuring out the best way to lay out a retail store.
Yeah, the main takeaway is that A/B testing is a really powerful tool for anyone who wants to make smarter decisions, no matter what industry they're in.
So before we go, I want to leave you with a little challenge. Think about something in your own work where A/B testing could come in handy. Maybe it's a new feature you're thinking about, or a process that needs some tweaking.
Or even just like how you communicate with your team.
Yeah, the possibilities are endless.
Don't be afraid to experiment. Try new things, get that data, and let it guide your decisions.
Well said, and on that note, we'll see you next time for another deep dive.